Hello, y'all. It's me. It's Dr. G. Welcome to another episode in Star-Spangled Studies. Today, we turn our eyes towards the Progressive Era. At the dawn of the 20th century, America stood as a colossus, forged in the fires of industrial revolution, its cities growing, its reach extending across the continents and oceans. Yet beneath this gleaming surface, a profound unease, the Gilded Age, with its dazzling fortunes, had cast a long, dark shadow. As our textbook describes it, quote, "The many problems associated with the Gilded Age, the rise of unprecedented fortunes and unprecedented poverty, controversies over imperialism, urban squalor, a near war between capital and labor, loosening social mores, unsanitary food production, the onrush of foreign immigration, environmental destruction, terrible forces seemed out of control, and the nation seemed imperiled." End quote. In our episodes building up to this one, we have navigated the turbulent waters of Reconstruction. We witnessed the meteoric rise of industry, the force that reshaped the nation's landscape and its social fabric, often at a brutal human cost. And we also charted America's first steps onto the world stage as an imperial power, an expansion that raised profound questions about the nation's identity and its ideals. These weren't separate stories. All of these were different aspects of the 19th turning into the 20th century. And they converged, all of these currents, by the turn of the 20th century, and they churned up a perfect storm of anxieties and aspirations. The very foundations of American life seemed to be shifting. As one contemporary observer at the time noted, quote, "The swift changes in our industrial system are causing equally swift changes in our religious, political, and social structures. An unseen and fearful revolution is taking place in the fiber and structure of society." End quote. The unfulfilled promises of Reconstruction, particularly regarding racial equality, festered and created deep societal wounds and systemic injustices. The unfettered growth of industrial capitalism, while generating immense wealth for some, also led to dangerous and deathly working conditions. It also led to squalid urban living for millions, as well as the rise of colossal monopolies that seemed to dwarf democratic institutions. And America's newfound imperial role, born from the ashes of the Spanish-American War and other imperial ventures, forced a reckoning with the nation's democratic principles, often mirroring and even amplifying domestic racial prejudices on the global stage. The Progressive Era, therefore, did not emerge out of a vacuum. It was a direct, if sometimes flawed and often contradictory, it was a response to these inherited crises, an attempt to grapple with the complex and often painful legacies of the preceding decades. Out of this change and crisis emerged a new spirit, a new impulse, what we call progressivism. It wasn't a single unified movement with a neat manifesto. Instead, it was a sprawling, multifaceted collection of efforts driven by diverse groups with diverse ideas and interests. They included urban middle class, women, journalists, academics, even some politicians and businessmen, all animated by a belief that society could be improved. Whatever their goals, our textbook tells us, quote, "Reform became the word of the age," end quote. At its core, quote, "Progressive reformers sought to bring order to chaos, to bring efficiency to inefficiency, and to bring justice to an era defined by its injustice," end quote. So, what did it mean to be progressive at the dawn of the 20th century? Who were these reformers? What did they fight for? And crucially, who was included in their vision of a better America? And maybe, and most importantly, who was left out? That's what we're going to be exploring today as we look at the Progressive Era. So let's go. If the Progressive Era was an attempt to cure the nation's ills, then the first step was to form a diagnosis. And the diagnosticians of this age were a new breed of investigative journalists who were dubbed muckrakers. The term was coined by President Theodore Roosevelt, who, while sometimes critical, acknowledged that, quote, the men with the muck rakes are often indispensable to the well-being of society, but only if they know when to stop raking the mud, end quote. These writers and photographers plunged into the darkest corners of American life, exposing corruption, exposing exploitation, and exposing injustice, and in doing so, they stirred the national conscience towards reform. Perhaps no muckraker was more visceral or had a more visceral impact than Upton Sinclair. His 1906 novel, The Jungle, was intended to be an expose of the, quote, brutal exploitation of labor in the meatpacking industry, unquote. Sinclair famously lamented, quote, I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach, end quote, and hit the stomach indeed. While he wanted to paint a horrifying picture of the conditions faced by immigrant workers in the Chicago stockyards, well, he said this, right? Quote, there were the men in the pickle rooms, scarce a one of these that had not some spot of horror on his person. All the joints in his fingers might have been eaten by acid one by one, end quote. Sounds like pretty bad conditions to work in. But when he says he hit people in the stomach, this is what he meant, the food that was being produced in these factories. Quote, there would be meat that had tumbled onto the floor, in the dirt and sawdust. Rats would race about it. Rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together, end quote. The public outcry to this food contamination was deafening. Thanks to the expose by Sinclair, this directly led to the passage of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, both of which brought in the FDA as we know it today. While Sinclair shocked the nation with tales of tainted meat, Ida M. Tarbell took on one of the most powerful entities in America, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Her meticulously researched series, The History of the Standard Oil Company, was published in McClure's magazine and then became a book in 1904, and it laid bare the ruthless monopolistic practices that built Rockefeller's empire. Tarbell, who grew up in Pennsylvania oil regions, and she saw her own father suffer under Standard Oil's tactics to get rich, argued forcefully against the notion that these predatory methods were somehow inevitable or necessary for industrial progress. You know, the justifications we talked about in the Gilded Age episodes. She depicted Standard Oil as, quote, unethical to its very core, asserting that, quote, our national life is on every side distinctly poorer, uglier, meaner for the kind of influence he exercises, end quote. He being Rockefeller. Her work fueled public anger and provided crucial ammunition for the government's antitrust case, which ultimately led to the breakup of Standard Oil Trust in 1911, part of the Progressive era's reforming of the trusts, but we'll get to that in a minute. The rot, however, wasn't just in the factories and the corporate boardrooms. It was also found in city halls. Lincoln Steffens, in his 1904 collection, The Shame of the Cities, exposed the pervasive political corruption that plagued major American urban centers like St. Louis and Minneapolis and Philadelphia, and New York City. He detailed how, quote, political machines exploited their power for personal gain, end quote, often in collusion with business interests. And I talked a little bit about this in the last episode. Steffens' work wasn't just an indictment. It was a call to civic action, galvanizing public support for reforms like primary elections, the direct election of senators, and the city manager system, all making government and aiming to make government more transparent and accountable and less corrupt. And then there was the color line, the deep, painful chasm of racial inequality. Ray Stannard Baker, another prominent muckraker, undertook a courageous journalistic investigation into what he called, quote, the exact present conditions and relationships of the Negro in American life, end quote. His book, Following the Color Line in 1908, based on extensive travels through the North and South, unflinchingly documented the harsh realities of Jim Crow segregation, as well as the effects of disenfranchisement and the ever-present terror of violence and lynching. Baker's stated goal was to provide, quote, a clear statement, and his work stands as a landmark piece of journalism on American race relations of this era. The journalistic unmasking of America's underbelly was a powerful catalyst for progressive change. It generated moral outrage, a collective sense of things had to change because things were so bad. But muckraking alone didn't dictate the full course of the reform. The direction of that change was also shaped by other intellectual and social currents. One of the most potent at the time was that what we call the social gospel. Figures like Walter Rauschenbusch, a Baptist minister and theologian, argued passionately in works like Christianity and the Social Crisis in 1907 that Christian faith demanded engagement with societal problems. Quote, the essential purpose of Christianity was to transform human society into the kingdom of God by regenerating all human relations, end quote. He believed that, quote, whoever uncouples the religious and the social life has not understood Jesus, end quote. This theological imperative provided a powerful moral framework for many reformers, urging them to address issues like poverty and inequality. And it came with, quote, actual inequality endangers the sense of equality. There is a rich class and a poor class, whose manner of life is wedged farther and farther apart, end quote. On the ground and in the heart of immigrant neighborhoods, the settlement house movement offered a practical model of social engagement. Jane Addams, the co-founder of Chicago's famed Hull House in 1889, became a leading voice for this approach. In her 1892 essay, The Subjective Necessity for Social Settlements, Addams articulated the profound need felt by many educated young people to bridge the gap between their privileged lives and the harsh realities of the urban poor. She argued that reformers must, quote, add the social function to democracy, end quote, and that her Hull House, quote, was opened on the theory that the dependence of classes on each other is reciprocal, end quote. For Addams, these settlements were not just about charity, they were about mutual learning and democratic participation. The muckrakers then lit the fuse. Their exposés created the public demand, the moral urgency for action against a broken system. But the specific reforms that reformers took, the solutions they proposed, and the debates that ensued were shaped by this broader ecosystem of ideas. The religious call to social justice, the practical experiments in community building, and, as we'll see, the often clashing visions of political leaders. It is also a testament to the sometimes unpredictable nature of public reaction. Sinclair aimed for the heart on labor exploitation, but he hit the stomach on food safety, demonstrating how the public's immediate concerns could channel the impact of these exposés in specific and sometimes unintended directions. The moral outrage sparked by muckrakers and the social conscience awakened by reformers needed a political vehicle to translate what they wanted to reform into lasting change. The Progressive era saw the rise of dynamic political leaders who, in different ways, sought to harness this new energy and reshape the relationship between the government, the businesses, and the American people. The era of presidential progressivism truly began with an unexpected tragedy, the assassination of President William McKinley in 1901. This act thrust his young and energetic vice president, who we met before, Theodore Roosevelt, into the White House as president. TR, as he became known, was a force of nature, to quote people at the time. He embraced the presidency as what he called a bully pulpit, and quickly became the face of progressive reform at the national level. One of his most famous monikers was that of being known as the Trust Buster. While not opposed to big businesses per se, Roosevelt believed that massive corporate monopolies or trusts that acted against the public interest needed to be regulated or, if necessary, broken up. He famously took on J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company, a massive railroad conglomerate, and won a victory symbolically captured in Udo Kepler's 1904 cartoon, Next, which depicted Standard Oil as an octopus with tentacles reaching for everything, including the White House, which Roosevelt was standing and defending. His domestic program, which he called a square deal, aimed to balance the interests of business, labor, and the consuming public, a square deal for all Americans. In a 1910 speech in Kansas, Roosevelt laid out his vision for what he called the new nationalism. This was a call for a more powerful and active federal government to ensure social justice and economic opportunity. Quote, "I stand for the square deal," Roosevelt declared. "But when I say that I am for the square deal, I mean not merely that I stand for fair play under the present rules of the game, but that I stand for having those rules changed so as to work for a more substantial equality of opportunity." End quote. He argued that, quote, "the new nationalism puts the nation and the national before the sectional or personal advantage. This new nationalism regards the executive power as the steward of the public welfare." End quote. This vision included controversial proposals for the time, like a graduated income tax and an inheritance tax on large fortunes. But it was clear that the president's role was much more, and that executive power, more specifically, than just something for businesses or for international squabbles. They were, in Roosevelt's words, steward of the public welfare. Roosevelt chose to not run for a third term in 1908, anointing William Howard Taft as his successor. Taft continued some of Roosevelt's trust-busting activities, actually initiating more antitrust suits than TR. However, he was generally more conservative in his approach and temperament, leading to a growing friction with the progressive wing of his Republican Party. The passage of the Payne-Aldrich tariff in 1909, which many progressives felt did not lower rates significantly enough, became a major point of contention and widened the split within his own party. This division set the stage for one of the most fascinating presidential elections in American history, the election of 1912. It was actually a four-way contest. Taft ran for re-election as the Republican incumbent. Theodore Roosevelt, dissatisfied with Taft's leadership, dramatically re-entered the political fray, running as the candidate of the newly formed Progressive Party, which was popularly known as the greatest party name that has ever been, the Bull Moose Party. The Democrats nominated Woodrow Wilson, the reform-minded governor of New Jersey, and representing the Socialist Party, back when we had socialist parties, was Eugene V. Debs, a powerful voice for radical change, someone we've seen earlier episodes. Wilson campaigned on a platform that he called New Freedom. While Roosevelt's new nationalism accepted big business but called for strong government regulation, Wilson's New Freedom initially emphasized restoring competition by breaking up large trusts and lowering tariffs to foster a more open marketplace. He argued that, quote, "changing economic conditions demanded new and aggressive government policies to preserve traditional American liberties," end quote. For Wilson, liberty in the modern age was not simply about being left alone. Quote, "freedom today," he asserted, "is something more than being let alone. The program of a government of freedom must be in these days be a positive, not a negative, merely." End quote. He believed that, quote, "without the watchful interference, the resolute interference of the government, there can be no fair play between individuals and such powerful institutions as the trusts." End quote. With the Republican vote split between Taft and Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson won the presidency. As president, Wilson oversaw a wave of significant progressive legislation. The Underwood Tariff of 1913 achieved a long-sought goal of substantially reducing import duties. The Federal Reserve Act of the same year fundamentally restructured the nation's banking system, creating 12 regional federal bank reserves to regulate the currency, manage credit, and provide greater financial stability. In 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act strengthened previous antitrust laws, more clearly defining monopolistic practices and, crucially, exempting labor unions from prosecution as conspiracies in restraint of trade. The Federal Trade Commission was also established in 1914 to investigate and prevent unfair business practices. While these domestic reforms were underway, the Progressive Era also coincided with America's growing involvement in international affairs, like we saw in the previous episode. The legacy of the Spanish-American War meant the U.S. now governed overseas territories like Puerto Rico and the Philippines, and they also exerted considerable influence over Cuba. For many progressives, including TR, this new global role was not seen as contradictory to their domestic agenda. They viewed American intervention as an opportunity to export progressive ideals of, quote, uplift, reform, and improvement to these other societies. The idea that the American expertise in governance, sanitation, and education could benefit supposedly less developed nations was appealing to many progressives. However, this imperial venture was fraught with contradictions and dissent from the very start. We'd only have to remember what we talked about last episode, the brutal Filipino-American War, which cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Filipino lives, which led many progressives to vehemently oppose imperialism. They argued that foreign adventures detracted from the much-needed reforms at home and also violated American democratic principles. Imperialism, as one analysis put it, quote, provided resources and markets that fueled economic growth, created opportunities for labor reforms, but also revealed complexities and contradictions in American foreign policy. The very act of governing foreign people without their consent sat very uneasy with the democratic rhetoric of the progressive movement. This period reveals a fascinating interplay between foreign entanglements and domestic concerns. Experiences abroad, such as, quote, observing the environmental consequences of unchecked resource extraction in newly acquired territories, informed the nation's approach to environmental reforms at home, end quote. Conversely, domestic racial ideologies, particularly the prevalent theories of social Darwinism and Anglo-Saxon white superiority that we previously talked about, provided a ready-made justification for that imperial control over non-white populations. W.E.B. Du Bois, in what scholars call his imperialism thesis, argued that the systemic subjugation of African Americans within the United States actually, quote, formed a mold of the arguments for U.S. global domination over other non-white peoples. The civilizing mission abroad often served as a mirror or even an extension of the racial hierarchies and prejudices at home, creating a complex feedback loop where domestic and foreign policies influenced and reinforced each other, often in troubling ways. The Progressive Era was indeed a time of fervent activism, with various groups demanding a fuller share of American democracy and economic opportunity. Yet as the nation grappled with the idea of reform, the question of who belonged, who counted, and whose progress mattered most revealed even more the deep and often painful divisions in American society. One of the most significant and ultimately successful movements of the era was the fight for women's suffrage. After decades of struggle, the campaign for votes for women gained powerful new momentum in the Progressive Era. Figures who were already prominent in other progressive causes, like Settlement House leader Jane Addams, anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells Barnett, birth control advocate Margaret Sanger, and workplace safety champion Florence Kelley, also lent their voices and energies to the suffrage movement. A key intellectual in that movement was Alice Stone Blackwell. Her 1917 publication, Answering Objections to Women's Suffrage, she systematically dismantled common arguments against granting women the vote. Her fundamental argument was one of basic fairness. Quote, is it fair and right that people who must obey the laws should have a voice in choosing the lawmakers, and that those who must pay the taxes should have a voice as to the amount of the tax? End quote. Blackwell and others refuted claims that suffrage would destroy chivalry. Quote, "Justice and chivalry are not, in the least, incompatible," she wrote. She also said that, well, women were not too emotional or irresponsible for voting. Suffragists employed a range of tactics, from massive parades and public speaking to more confrontational methods like picketing the White House, as seen in the famous College Days on the Picket Line protest, as well as acts of civil disobedience. Their perseverance eventually paid off. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, granting women the right to vote nationwide. However, as one door to democratic participation opened for some, others remained firmly shut, or they were slammed harder. For African Americans, the Progressive Era was, in many respects, a period of profound regression, not progression, and it intensified the oppression of which they lived. Our textbook grimly notes this, quote, "America's tragic racial history was not erased by the Progressive Era. In fact, in all too many ways, reform removed African Americans even further from American public life," end quote. The post-Reconstruction South witnessed the systemic erection of the Jim Crow regime. The Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, which enshrined that doctrine of separate but equal, provided federal sanction for legal segregation in virtually every aspect of public and private life, and not just in the South. This was accompanied by the wholesale disenfranchisement of black men through devices like poll tax, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, which were designed to circumvent the 15th Amendment. The impact of this was devastating. I've mentioned this before. Quote, "Louisiana had 130,000 black voters in 1896. Only 5,320 voted in 1900. End quote. Overlaying this legal and political subjugation was the constant threat and reality of racial violence, most horrifically manifested in lynching. We've talked about Ida B. Wells Barnett, the journalist and activist who had incredible courage and spearheaded a national and international anti-lynching crusade. After the lynching of 3 successful black businessmen in Memphis in 1892, an event that shattered her previous belief that economic success would lead to white acceptance, Wells dedicated her life to exposing the barbarity of mob violence. "I am before the people today," she declared, "because of a deep-seated conviction that the country at large does not know the extent to which lynch laws prevail, nor the conditions which force into exile those who speak the truth." She meticulously documented lynchings and powerfully refuted the common white Southern claim that they were primarily a response to sexual assaults on white women, revealing instead that economic competition, political assertion, or simply any perceived challenge to white supremacy were often the true motives of lynching. In this climate of intense racial hostility, black thinkers and leaders debated the best strategies for survival and advancement. We've already talked about 2 towering individuals, Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, and how their ideas sharply contrasted the vision of what Americans should do, black Americans, in this context. And I'll go over them quickly here. So Booker T. Washington, if you remember, was born enslaved and rose to become the founder of the Tuskegee Institute and the most prominent black leader of his time. His famous 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech advocated a path for economic self-sufficiency, vocational training, and accommodation to the reality of segregation, not being against it. He urged black Americans to, quote, "cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down in making friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom we are surrounded," end quote. Focusing, or for black people to focus on agricultural and industrial skills. To white Southerners, he offered reassurance, quote, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress," end quote. Washington believed that, quote, "the opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house," end quote. He prioritized economic advancement over the immediate demands for political and social equality. W.E.B. Du Bois offered a different vision. He was a Harvard-educated scholar and intellectual, and he offered a powerful critique to Washington's approach. His 1903 work, The Souls of Black Folks, Du Bois characterized Washington's philosophy as one of adjustment and submission, his words. He argued that Washington was asking black people to give up, for at least the present, first, political power, quote, and second, insistence on civil rights, third, higher education of Negro youth, end quote. Du Bois countered with a fundamental question, quote, is it possible and probable that 9 millions of men can effective progress in economic lines if they are deprived of political rights, made a servile caste, and allowed only the most meager chance for developing their exceptional men? If history and reason give any distinct answer, it is an emphatic no, end quote. Du Bois famously articulated the concept of double consciousness, the sense of, quote, always looking at oneself through the eyes of other, of being an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, end quote. He was instrumental in the founding of the Niagara Movement in 1905, as well as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1909, organizations dedicated to demanding immediate civil rights and an end to racial discrimination. The Progressive Era also saw the continued, often violent struggles of the American labor movement. We've talked about Eugene V. Debs, who began as a railway worker and a labor organizer, and he became the leading figure of American socialism, leading the American Socialist Party. His conversion to socialism was, in his words, forged in the roar of conflict, particularly the brutal suppression of the Pullman strike that we discussed in an earlier episode, where he saw, quote, in the gleam of every bayonet and the flash of every rifle, the class struggle was revealed, end quote. Debs ran for president 5 times on the Socialist Party ticket, advocating for worker control of industry and a fundamental restructuring of the capitalist system. The human cost of unregulated industry was starkly illustrated by the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City in March of 1911. It was a catastrophe that seared itself into the nation's memory. 146 workers, mostly young women who were immigrants as well as young girls, perished when the fire broke out in the factory. They were trapped by locked doors, which was a common practice to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks, as well as inadequate and often unusable fire escapes. Eyewitness William Shepard described the horror. Quote, I learned a new sound that day, a more horrible sound than description can picture. It was the thud of a speeding, living body on a stone sidewalk. Thud dead, thud dead, thud dead, thud dead. 62 thud deads, end quote. Survivor Dora Maisler later spoke of the, quote, unstable and dangerous machinery and other unsafe working conditions, end quote, as well as the, quote, chaos, fear, and desperations as workers tried to flee a burning building. The Triangle Fire became a national symbol of corporate greed and neglect. The immense public outrage, fueled by graphic newspaper accounts and photographs, led to a wave of reform in labor laws, as well as new factory safety standards and the establishment of workers' compensation systems. Francis Perkins, who witnessed the horrors of the fire from the street below, would later become the Secretary of Labor under Franklin Delano Roosevelt and a key architect of the New Deal labor protections. The varied experiences of women, African Americans, and industrial workers during this period reveal a crucial aspect of the Progressive Era that we need to talk about. Progress was not a universally applied concept. While some groups achieved significant legislative victories and expanded their rights, others faced intensified oppression or found their concerns marginalized and ignored. The very definition of who constituted the people worthy of the Progressive Era's uplift was often narrowly drawn, frequently drawn along lines of class, race, and ethnicity. The fight for women's suffrage, for instance, largely benefited white women, as black women in the South continued to be disenfranchised by Jim Crow laws, even after the passage of the 19th Amendment. This selective application of reform highlights the inherent contradictions within progressivism and compels us to ask, for every advancement, progress for whom? The Progressive Era wasn't just about work and reform and political battles. It was also a time when Americans began to have more leisure and leisure time, and new forms of entertainment emerged to fill that time, reflecting both the era's dynamism and its deep-seated social tensions. Reduced working hours for some, the introduction of Saturday half-days, for instance, and even unpaid vacation time, meant that more people had time for recreation. And what better place to recreate than in the national pastime? Baseball. Baseball had become growing in popularity since the mid-19th century, especially after the Civil War, and it truly cemented its status as America's pastime during these years we're talking about now. It transitioned from a sometimes rough urban sport associated with drinking and gambling into a more organized and widely revered national spectacle. The game's rise mirrored the nation's urban industrialization. New steel and concrete ballparks became prominent social civic gathering places. A key figure in this transformation was Albert Goodwill Spaulding. You might have heard of Spaulding. He was a former star player turned sporting goods magnate and league organizer. Spaulding was a master promoter who worked tirelessly to Americanize baseball, casting it as a sport that embodied democratic values, as well as fair play, and harnessed the national spirit. He described it as, quote, athletic turmoil played and applauded in an unconventional, enthusiastic, and American manner, end quote. Baseball in this vision was a unifier. It was, quote, a point of unification for a nation divided. It fostering patriotic pride, and it also created a shared cultural experience for a place that was so diverse with new immigrants. However, this carefully constructed narrative of Americanism also involved profound exclusions, most notably racial segregation. Black players were barred from Major League Baseball, a color line that would be drawn and would persist until Jackie Robinson broke through in 1947. So, as we can see, it was a stark contradiction of the game's proclaimed democratic ideals. We'll get back to Jackie Robinson in a later episode. While black athletes were excluded from baseball's highest professional ranks, one black man dramatically challenged the color line in another hugely popular sport, boxing. Jack Johnson, known as the Galveston Giant, was a figure of extraordinary skill, charisma, and defiance. In 1908, after years of trying to break through the boxing color bar, he defeated Tommy Burns to become the first black heavyweight champion of the world, a title of immense symbolic importance. His heavyweight championship reign ignited a firestorm of racial anxiety. As one account puts it, quote, boxing fans viewed the sport through the lens of nationality and race. A white boxer defeating a black opponent reinforced ideas about white supremacy, but if a black man won, it would contradict ideas about white superiority, end quote. As long as a black man held the crown, a search for the great white hope to dethrone Jack Johnson became a national obsession. And this culminated in 1910, the fight of the century, the first fight of the century in the 1900s. There's several of them. But this fight of the century was to bring back the retired former champion, Jim Jeffries, the undefeated Jim Jeffries, to fight against Jack Johnson. He was the great white hope to dethrone and bring the heavyweight championship back to the white race. And the racial stakes, I cannot stress, could not have been higher. Jack Johnson destroyed Jim Jeffries. It was a decisive victory, and it was a stunning blow to the white supremacist ideology of the time. But Johnson's challenge extended far beyond the boxing ring itself, and the reason for and hype for a great white hype was because of how he lived his life. He was flamboyant. He was unapologetic. and he openly dated and married white women against the conventions of the time. He drove fast cars, and he refused to adhere to the demeaning etiquette of Jim Crow. He, quote, lived a lifestyle that whites deemed unsuitable for many African Americans, which included displaying his wealth and relationships with white women, end quote. Johnson himself reflected, quote, my life, almost from its very start, has been filled with tragedy and romance, failures and successes, poverty and wealth, misery and happiness, end quote. And the societal backlash was intense and vicious. Quote, authorities disapproved of any African American man holding the heavyweight title, a symbol that represented masculinity at the time, end quote. And his defiance of racial norms made him a target. In fact, it was the government that would bring him down. In 1913, Johnson was convicted under the Mann Act for allegedly transporting a white woman, who would become his wife, across state lines for, quote, immoral purposes, end quote. The Mann Act being used against prostitution, but here, in a charge against Jack Johnson, was widely recognized then, as now, as racially motivated. He fled the country for several years before eventually returning to serve his sentence. Jack Johnson's career and life story powerfully illustrate, quote, how sports can serve as a platform for social change, making him an enduring symbol of black resistance. In 2018, he was posthumously pardoned, a belated acknowledgement of the injustices that he faced. Beyond the ballpark and the boxing ring, new forms of mass entertainment captivated Americans. Vaudeville theaters offered a diverse array of acts. These included singers and dancers, comedians, magicians like the great Harry Houdini, animal acts, and more. It was one show with a whole bunch of acts that were not related to each other. These shows often crossed economic and ethnic lines, providing a common cultural experiences in rapidly diversifying cities. In addition to these, for more thrilling escapes, amusement parks like New York's Coney Island beckoned with wild rides, the first roller coasters, as well as exotic animal attractions, elaborate stage productions, and even freak shows. Coney Island offered spectacles like, quote, a ride to the moon to watch moon maidens eat green cheese, or witness the electrocution of an elephant, end quote. A bizarre mix of the technological marvel as well as sensationalism. A new form of visual storytelling also appeared in this era, motion pictures. Motion pictures were initially novelties, and they were viewed in things like kinetoscopes or as short acts in vaudeville. But film soon moved into the storefronts in little machines called Nickelodeons. And these were the precursors to modern movie theaters, offering cheap entertainment primarily to working class audiences. These new forms of leisure and entertainment were more than just frivolous diversions. They became important arenas where cultural values could be projected and shaped. They could be also performed and contested. While offering an escape, they also reflected and sometimes reinforced the existing social hierarchies related to class, race, and gender. The carefully crafted narrative of baseball as the all-American game, for example, was built on a foundation of racial exclusion. Jack Johnson's very public triumphs and defiant lifestyle in the highly visible arena of championship boxing became a flashpoint precisely because they directly confronted and threatened deeply entrenched racial norms and fears. His body, his victories, his relationships became potent symbols of black prowess and a direct challenge to white dominance. Maybe I should mention that after his victories, there were riots. But even the seemingly democratic new media of vaudeville and cinema would soon develop their own patterns of representation and exclusion, reflecting once again the broader societal tensions of this dynamic and contradictory progressive era. Despite the profound limitations and contradictions that I've highlighted, the progressive era left an indelible mark on modern America. It fundamentally altered the role of government, establishing precedents for federal intervention in the economy and society that would be expanded upon in later decades, most notably during the Great Depression and the New Deal. Many of the constitutional amendments and laws passed during this period, the federal income tax, the direct election of senators, women's suffrage, antitrust legislation, the Food and Drug Administration, remain pillars of American governance today. And even if its failures, the progressive era laid bare the deep-seated injustices that would fuel future reform movements, including the long struggle for civil rights. It becomes clear that progressivism was never a monolithic entity, as I had mentioned at the start. It was a complex, contested, and evolving set of ideas and movements, encompassing a wide array of individuals and groups with diverse and sometimes deeply conflicting ideas, ideals, and aims. What was considered progressive by some at the time, such as eugenics or disenfranchisement as a form of good government reform in the South, is now rightly condemned as discriminatory and unjust. The era itself was characterized by intense internal debates about the very meaning and direction of reform. Think of the contrasting visions of TR's New Nationalism or Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom, or the profound disagreement between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. Historians continue to grapple with the nature and legacy of this period, with some emphasizing its democratic impulses and genuine achievements, while others highlight its exclusionary practices and the crimes of progressivism. This ongoing debate challenges us to critically examine who defines what it means to be progress, who benefits from it, whose voices are amplified or silenced, not only in the past, but in our own time as well. The progressive era serves as a vital, if sometimes uncomfortable, reminder that reform movements, even those with noble intentions, can harbor significant blind spots and even perpetuate new forms of injustice under the banner of improvement. The questions raised by the progressives about the role of government, the responsibility of wealth, the rights of citizens, and the very meaning of American democracy continue to resonate with us today. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Star-Spangled Studies. I'll see y'all in the past.